October 2021, Blanco County, Texas. 14 seconds into a routine trail camera clip, something enters the frame that no wildlife removal crew had a category for. It moved with a precision that did not match any predator on record for that species, and it was systematically dismantling a feral hog nest, piglet by piglet, using a technique nobody had documented in that animal before 2010. Researchers pulled a decade of archived footage after that single clip and found the same thing buried in it over and over, unnoticed, unexplained, right in front of them the entire time. That discovery didn't just solve one mystery in one Texas county. It exposed a mistake the government had been actively funding, one that made the crisis worse every single year it ran. And the same pattern of humans accidentally sabotaging their own fix is playing out right now in swamps, deserts, and river systems. Most people have never connected to each other. Join us, and let's discover the invasive species disasters that got so catastrophic, nature itself had to step in and fix them. Let's go.
Topic number 13. Feral hogs. 14 seconds into a trail camera clip from Blanco County, Texas, something enters the frame that no removal crew had a name for. 5 centuries earlier, Spanish explorers had released domestic pigs along the Gulf Coast as a living food reserve, expecting to come back for them. Nobody ever did. Those pigs bred without limit, spread continent-wide, and in the early 1900s collided with imported Eurasian boar released for sport hunting. The hybrid that resulted was leaner, faster, and nearly impossible to kill cleanly on the first shot. A single sow produces up to 24 piglets a year, and a population can double in under 5 months, a curve with no natural stopping point. The USDA counts roughly 6.9 million feral hogs nationwide, with Texas alone holding an estimated 2.6 million, spread across 253 of its 254 counties. These animals sprint at 30 miles an hour, clear 4-foot fences without breaking stride, and carry tusks over 6 inches long beneath thick skin that turns light ammunition into an inconvenience. Every trap, every bounty, and every helicopter sweep produced the same result, a dip, then a violent rebound. But buried inside years of overlooked infrared footage was a detail nobody in the industry had thought to look for. Something was actively hunting the unhuntable, operating completely under the radar. Before we reveal what was systematically dismantling the Texas hog population, we need to look at what happens when human intervention fails completely.
200 million. That is the current estimate for cane toads occupying more than 1.2 million square kilometers of the Australian continent, an area roughly the size of Texas and New Mexico combined, completely saturated with a single toxic amphibian. It started in 1935, with 101 toads released near cairns to control a beetle that lives high on cane stalks, entirely out of reach of a toad that cannot climb. The agricultural plan failed within its first year, and nobody bothered to pull the toads back out of the ecosystem. Each female lays tens of thousands of eggs annually, and the parotoid glands on their backs secrete a poison lethal to native predators that never evolved resistance to it. Quolls, goannas, freshwater crocodiles, and death adders have suffered catastrophic local die-offs from a single bite. Yellow-spotted monitor populations collapsed by up to 90% in invaded regions. The invasion front itself has accelerated from roughly 10 kilometers a year in the early decades to over 50 kilometers a year now. Researchers tracking the leading edge found something even more alarming than the speed itself. The toads arriving first at any new frontier are evolving longer legs and faster metabolisms than the toads following behind them. The frontier is breeding a faster invader in real time, and volunteer eradication crews are physically chasing a population that is actively outrunning the humans trying to stop it, leaving a massive trail of dead predators in its wake.
Only 1% of people know the dark truth behind what we are about to show you next. If you want to be part of the few who actually know what's happening in the world, subscribe and leave a like right now. Done? Look at this.
Topic number 11. Silver carp. A silver carp can launch itself 4 feet out of the water at the sound of a boat engine, colliding with boaters hard enough to break bones and knock people unconscious. And that physical danger is the least terrifying part of this story.
Bighead and silver carp entered the Mississippi River Basin in the 1970s, imported to clean algae out of aquaculture ponds, until severe flooding breached the containment lagoons that were supposed to hold them forever. The real threat sits at the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, the final artificial connection between the Mississippi system and Lake Michigan. If these fish establish themselves inside the Great Lakes, researchers warn they could gut a fishing industry worth billions of dollars by stripping out the plankton every native species depends on. The Army Corps of Engineers built an experimental electric barrier across the canal in 2002, since upgraded into a permanent system pulsing direct current strong enough to repel an adult carp before it crosses the line. In June 2023, officials in Minnesota pulled 408 carp from a single stretch of water in one operation, a number that completely stunned biologists who believed containment was holding steady. Researchers estimate it would take just 10 breeding pairs slipping past that electric barrier to seed an unstoppable population inside the lakes. The barrier has held so far, but nobody has tested what happens when a massive flood event finally knocks the power grid offline.
Topic number 10. Zebra mussels. A single female zebra mussel releases up to 1 million eggs in one reproductive season, and divers sent to inspect Great Lakes water intake pipes have found surfaces coated inches thick with shells, cutting the original pipe diameter nearly in half. Ballast water dumped from transatlantic cargo ships in the mid-1980s introduced the species to Lake St. Clair, and it spread through every one of the Great Lakes within a decade, with no natural predator waiting for it anywhere on the continent. Each mussel filters roughly 1 liter of water a day, stripping out the microscopic plankton native fish larvae need to survive their first weeks of life, triggering total food web collapses in areas of dense colonization. The damage nobody had accurately modeled came from underwater infrastructure. Zebra mussels colonize any hard surface they touch, including the intake systems of massive power plants and municipal water treatment facilities, clogging them so completely that entire plants have shut down for emergency physical cleaning. Estimated damage to Great Lakes infrastructure alone has passed $5 billion since the invasion began, a staggering cost driven by a mollusk barely the size of a human fingernail. The species has since spread into the Mississippi system and dozens of reservoirs across the American West, carried unknowingly on the hulls of recreational boats. Every state west of the Rockies now runs mandatory inspection checkpoints. Hunting for an invader, most people just step right over.
Topic number 9. Lionfish. A single lionfish can strip up to 90% of the native fish population off a patch of Caribbean reef within weeks of arriving, and divers have pulled specimens open to find more than 20 individual prey fish packed inside one stomach. Marine biologists first documented lionfish off Florida in the mid-1980s, likely dumped from private home aquariums into Biscayne Bay, and by the 2000s, the species had spread from North Carolina down to Brazil. Each female releases up to 2 million eggs a year, and Atlantic reef fish have absolutely no instinct to recognize the lionfish's venomous spines as a threat, because nothing in this ocean ever produced a predator that looked like this. Juvenile fish and crustaceans that reef ecosystems depend on for their basic structural survival are disappearing from invaded reefs at a pace that easily outstrips nearly every native predator combined. Conventional commercial fishing barely touches the population, since lionfish evade standard hook and line methods and easily swim through typical nets. What has actually slowed the invasion is stranger than any funded government control program: organized underwater spearfishing tournaments and a deliberate campaign to build consumer restaurant demand, turning a highly venomous invasive killer into a premium menu item. It is currently the only operational method keeping pace with how fast this fish reproduces, holding the line strictly in the reef zones divers can physically reach on a daily basis.
10 billion. That is the estimated peak population of European rabbits ravaging Australia by the 1920s, entirely descended from just 24 animals released on a private Victoria estate in 1859 for recreational hunting purposes. This remains the absolute fastest mammal colonization ever recorded on Earth. Within 50 years, those rabbits had spread across nearly the entire continent, devouring native vegetation down to bare soil and triggering catastrophic erosion that permanently altered the topsoil across enormous stretches of grazing land. In 1907, Australia built the rabbit-proof fence, stretching over 2,000 miles across Western Australia, an engineering project on the scale of a national border wall constructed for the sole purpose of stopping a rodent. Rabbits were already firmly established on both sides of the fence line before construction even finished. The real turning point came in 1950 when scientists deliberately released myxomatosis, a highly viral disease lethal to rabbits, directly into the wild population. Within 2 years, it had wiped out an estimated 99% of Australia's rabbits, cementing it as one of the most effective biological control operations ever recorded in human history. But the survivors carried genetic resistance forward into their offspring, and by the 1990s, the population had rebounded violently into the hundreds of millions. Scientists deployed a second weaponized virus in 1996, and the rabbits are already rapidly breeding resistance to that one too.
Topic number 7. Brown tree snake. Here is where this list stops being about crop damage and raw dollar figures and shifts into something much darker: total, permanent ecological extinction. Before a pregnant brown tree snake, or possibly several, arrived hidden in the cargo hold of a military aircraft after World War II, Guam supported 12 species of native forest birds found nowhere else on the planet. 10 of those 12 are gone completely, forever, and the remaining 2 survive only in heavily guarded captive breeding programs holding fewer than 200 individuals combined. This is not a slow population decline. This is an entire category of species systematically erased from the planet by an animal that hitched a ride on one flight. The snake population on Guam has been measured at over 3,000 individuals per square mile in some dense forest zones, hunting an isolated island that never evolved a single natural defense against a climbing predator. Losing the birds triggered a secondary cascade nobody anticipated. Native trees on Guam depend entirely on those birds to disperse their seeds across the forest floor, and researchers have now documented those specific trees failing to reproduce at all. Their seeds simply drop and rot under the parent tree instead of spreading. One accidental introduction erased the birds, and now it is actively erasing the ancient forest that depended on them, pushing the damage into territory nothing else has touched.
Topic number 6. Nutria. A single nutria eats a quarter of its own body weight in delicate wetland vegetation every single day. And unlike native herbivores, it consumes the deep root systems along with the surface growth. This feeding pattern leaves behind what biologists call an eat-out, a patch of marsh stripped down to bare, unstable mud that literally never regrows. Nutria are large, semi-aquatic rodents native to South America, brought into Louisiana in the early 1900s for the commercial fur trade. And when that market completely collapsed decades later, thousands either escaped or were released directly into the coastal wetlands. By the late 1990s, the state was estimating a wild population running as high as 6 million animals. Once the root systems holding the soil together are severed and consumed, the mud washes away with the very next tide, converting solid marsh into open water permanently. A single coast-wide survey found over 100,000 acres of Louisiana wetland completely destroyed exactly this way. In 2002, the state launched an aggressive bounty program, paying hunters per severed tail turned in. And in some seasons, hunters have brought in over 300,000 nutria, cutting damage by more than 90% in areas under heavily sustained pressure. But officials admit the program cannot physically outrun the coastline's other problems, as every acre of marsh a nutria strips bare vanishes into the Gulf of Mexico faster than any human crew can rebuild it.
Topic number 5. Burmese python. Raccoon sightings have plummeted by more than 99%. Opossum sightings are down more than 98%. And bobcats have dropped by nearly 90% across massive stretches of territory. Marsh rabbits are functionally gone from entire sections of the park. That is exactly what a single invasive snake species did to the Florida Everglades in just 3 decades. And fewer than 1% of the pythons responsible have ever even been seen by human eyes. Burmese pythons entered the exotic pet trade in the 1970s, and isolated escapees, along with deliberate releases,
established a silent wild breeding population by the 1980s. A 1992 hurricane then destroyed a commercial python breeding facility near the park boundary, releasing an unknown number of highly capable snakes straight into the wetland. Estimates for the current population in South Florida now range as high as 300,000, and researchers openly admit that terrifying number may still be too low. Female pythons lay up to 100 eggs a year, and adults have been reliably measured at nearly 20 feet, long enough to suffocate and swallow a full-grown deer entirely whole. The state now runs highly publicized python removal competitions with cash prizes, and trained hunting teams work the swamp year-round. Even the absolute most successful hunters, working full-time, manage to remove only a microscopic fraction of a percent of the population annually, leaving the ecosystem completely hollowed out.
Topic number 4. Nile perch. The deliberate introduction of the Nile perch into Lake Victoria in the 1950s triggered what biologists officially classify as the most catastrophic vertebrate extinction event of the 20th century. British colonial officials released the massive predatory fish to boost the local commercial fishing industry, completely ignoring warnings from ecologists about the fragile underwater ecosystem. Lake Victoria held over 500 deeply specialized species of cichlid fish, a highly complex evolutionary web found absolutely nowhere else on Earth. The Nile perch, a heavily armored apex predator that can grow to over 6 feet long and weigh 400 pounds, proceeded to systematically devour the native cichlids, driving an estimated 200 distinct species into permanent extinction within a few decades. As the native algae-eating fish vanished into the stomachs of the perch, massive unchecked algae blooms began suffocating the lake, depleting oxygen levels and creating enormous aquatic dead zones. The surrounding land suffered just as heavily. To preserve the massive oily perch fillets, local populations had to smoke the meat, leading to rampant deforestation along the lake's shores just to gather enough firewood. A single invasive fish designed to boost a local economy ended up permanently destroying an ancient evolutionary hotspot, collapsing the water quality and stripping the surrounding forests bare, proving exactly how fast human ecological engineering can completely backfire.
Topic number 3. Kudzu. It is widely known as the vine that ate the American South, and walking through a heavily infested forest feels like wandering through a draped, suffocating green graveyard. Kudzu was heavily promoted in the 1930s by the Soil Conservation Service as a miraculous solution for agricultural soil erosion, and the government actually paid southern farmers cash to plant millions of seedlings across their properties. The aggressive Japanese vine found a perfectly humid climate with zero natural predators or harsh winter freezes to hold it back, and it exploded across a landscape. Kudzu can grow an astonishing 1 foot per day during the summer months, rapidly climbing vertical surfaces and completely blanketing mature trees, power lines, and abandoned buildings under a solid wall of heavy leaves. Once draped over a forest canopy, the vine systematically blocks all sunlight from reaching the native vegetation below, literally starving mature oak and pine trees to death, while its massive root system drains the soil of moisture. Decades after the government paid to spread it, the vine covers an estimated 3 million acres across the region, pulling down utility poles with its sheer physical weight and costing power companies and landowners millions in constant mechanical removal. The vine aggressively overpowers any chemical herbicide, requiring crews to physically excavate the massive underground root crowns just to slow its relentless forward march across the countryside.
Topic number 2. European starling. In 1890, an eccentric Shakespeare enthusiast named Eugene Schieffelin released 60 European starlings into New York's Central Park because he wanted America to contain every single bird mentioned in the playwright's works. That bizarre, romantic gesture unleashed one of the most destructive agricultural and ecological plagues in modern North American history. Those 60 birds multiplied rapidly, spreading from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific within a century, and the current population now sits comfortably at over 200 million individuals. Starlings are highly aggressive cavity nesters,
actively evicting native species like bluebirds and woodpeckers from their nests, sometimes killing the native nestlings just to take over the space. Beyond devastating local bird populations, massive flocks containing hundreds of thousands of starlings descend on agricultural operations, consuming huge quantities of cultivated fruit and aggressively stealing premium grain directly from cattle feedlots. The corrosive droppings left behind by these colossal roosting flocks physically damage steel infrastructure, spread diseases to livestock, and create severe aviation hazards near major airports. In 1960, a flock of starlings was sucked into the engines of a commercial airline taking off from Boston, bringing the plane down and claiming 62 lives. A massive continental crisis born entirely from one man's personal obsession with 16th century theater literature.
Topic number 1. Coyote. Remember the Blanco County trail camera footage from the start of this list? What researchers finally realized was that coyotes across Texas had built a highly coordinated hunting technique never documented before 2010. A lead coyote would approach a feral hog nest from downwind, drawing the furious 200-pound mother's attention, while 2 flanking coyotes struck the piglets in a synchronized burst lasting under 5 seconds. Necropsies on coyotes captured near Fort Hood proved nearly a third were actively hunting feral hog piglets, targeting the exact engine behind the massive population explosion. In counties with dense coyote populations, feral hog numbers were quietly dropping by 20% without a single human trap deployed. But that discovery exposed a catastrophic mistake. For years, states had been paying hunters massive bounties to wipe out coyotes, treating them as an unrelated nuisance. In counties where coyote populations dropped heavily due to those bounties, the feral hog population tripled within 3 years. States had been spending millions of public dollars actively eliminating the only biological force working continuously for free against the worst invasive species crisis in the country. The most effective weapon against the $3 billion feral hog disaster was never a helicopter, a massive federal budget, or an advanced trap. It was the heavily persecuted scavenger that every agency had spent decades trying to completely wipe off the map.
If you thought this was terrifying, you are not ready for what they found in the video on your screen. Click it right now. The truth is worse than you think.